3:15 in the morning. The USS Gerald R. Ford was already a hive of controlled, lethal violence. The carrier strike group had received the execution order from Indo-Pacific Command exactly 45 minutes earlier, and the usual pre-flight safety buffers were being discarded in favor of maximum combat acceleration. Whether the massive Chinese early warning radar arrays at Zhanjiang would detect the incoming strike package before the first wave crossed the coast remained the only question that mattered to the thousands of sailors on board. The air on the flight deck was a freezing gale of salt spray mixed with the high-pitched, bone-rattling scream of jet turbines. Electromagnetic launch rails hummed with a deep, subterranean power, and the darkness was illuminated only by the rhythmic flashing of signal wands and the blue-white heat of afterburners. Inside the primary flight control tower, the air boss watched the digital displays showing the status of 75 aircraft currently being prepped for the initial assault. The carrier was steaming at a speed of 30 knots into a stiff headwind, the massive hull slicing through the black waters of the South China Sea like a razor. 20 miles to the north, the escorting destroyer DDG-113 and the cruiser CG-73 maintained a tight defensive perimeter, their ANSPY-6 radars scanning the horizon for any sign of a Chinese response. The deck crew, a blur of colored jerseys, moved with a practiced efficiency that defined the United States Navy. Yellow-shirted taxi directors guided 25-ton aircraft with inches to spare, while red-shirted ordnance teams made final checks on 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs and AGM-158 standoff missiles. The silence of the pre-dawn sea was shattered as the first F-35 Bravo reached the end of Catapult 1. The electromagnetic aircraft launch system engaged with a low, metallic thrum that vibrated through the steel of the ship, followed instantly by the deafening roar of the engine at full combat power. The stealth fighter was flung into the black sky, its twin engines carving two brilliant white scars into the darkness. Every 30 seconds, another aircraft followed, a relentless conveyor belt of American air power designed for a single, devastating purpose. By 3:45 in the morning, the first wave of 30 aircraft had formed up in the darkness 5,000 feet above the carrier. They flew in total electronic silence, their positions marked only by the infrared data links appearing on each pilot's helmet-mounted display. The mission objective was absolute: the total destruction of the Zhanjiang naval base, the strategic heart of the Chinese South Sea Fleet, before the sun rose over the horizon. For the pilots of Carrier Air Wing 8, this was no longer a training exercise or a routine patrol. This was a high-stakes strike against one of the most heavily defended naval installations in the world. The cockpit of the lead F-35 Bravo was a sanctuary of green light and synthetic voice alerts, protected from the freezing air outside by a thick canopy of specialized glass. The flight lead checked his fuel levels and the status of his internal weapons bay, where two precision-guided munitions sat ready for release. Behind him, the massive shape of the USS Gerald R. Ford was already fading into the gloom, leaving only the white foam of its wake. 200 miles to the west, the target waited. Zhanjiang was not merely a port, it was a fortress protected by layers of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles and a ring of coastal batteries. The strike package included 10 EA-18 Golf Growlers, aircraft specifically designed to blind the eyes of the Chinese defense network. Their jamming pods were already drawing power, prepared to flood the enemy's radar screens with a wall of electronic noise. As the formation turned toward the western coast, the final command was given over the secure link, commencing Operation Iron Threshold. The flight lead felt the physical push of the engines as he accelerated to Mach 0.9. The sound of the wind screaming past his fuselage. Below them, the sea was an endless field of black marble, indifferent to the fire that was about to descend upon the mainland. The United States Navy was no longer observing the situation. It was moving to settle it. 4:15 in the morning. The edge of the Chinese Air Defense Identification Zone. The lead EA-18 Golf Growler, designated as Raven 1, leveled its wings at an altitude of 25,000 feet as it crossed the invisible line of the maritime border. The cockpit was a cramped, high-tech sanctuary where the air smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of high-power electronics. Behind the pilot, the electronic warfare officer monitored a complex array of digital waterfalls on his tactical displays, each one representing a different frequency of the Chinese integrated air defense system. The United States Navy had spent decades preparing for this specific moment, and the equipment was now drawing massive amounts of power from the aircraft's twin engines to begin the suppression of the enemy's eyes. The electronic warfare officer engaged the ALQ-218 tactical jamming system, sending a wall of invisible, high-energy noise toward the Chinese mainland. 60 miles to the west, on the shores of the Leijiao Peninsula, the radar screens of the coastal defense sites began to flicker and distort under the weight of the digital interference. The air around the EA-18 Golf Growler felt charged, a subtle vibration in the airframe that only the crew could perceive as the jamming pods reached maximum output. Below them, the South China Sea was a vast, black void hidden by a layer of thick maritime mist that clung to the surface of the water, masking the movements of the fleet below. Inside the strike package, 12 F-35 Bravo fighters maintained a staggered formation 5 miles ahead of the jamming platform. These fifth-generation stealth fighters were operating in total electronic silence, their internal weapons bays sealed tight to minimize their radar cross-section to the size of a small bird. They were flying at a speed of 950 kilometers per hour, their pilots relying on the advanced sensor fusion of their aircraft to share data without emitting a single detectable radar pulse. The tactical objective for this phase was the total suppression of the enemy's long-range sensors, creating a narrow corridor of safety through which the heavier strike elements could pass. 4 HQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missile batteries were currently active along the coast, their search radars sweeping the horizon with a relentless, rhythmic intensity. The EA-18 Golf Growler identified the specific signature of each battery, categorizing them in real time and assigning specific jamming frequencies to neutralize them. The electronic screen was not intended to make the American presence invisible. Instead, it was designed to create a chaotic field of false targets and ghost signatures that would make an accurate missile lock impossible. The sky remained dark, but the invisible battlefield was already burning, with the digital intensity of 1,000 suns as the electronic warfare officers fought for control of the electromagnetic spectrum. The pilot of Raven 1 adjusted the throttle, keeping the aircraft within the optimal jamming envelope, while the F-35 Bravo fighters pushed further into the hostile zone. The mission clock on the primary flight display ticked forward toward 4:25 in the morning, the designated time for the first kinetic engagement. The tactical situation was fluid, with the Chinese military attempting to counter the jamming by rapidly shifting their radar frequencies, a move that the American software responded to in milliseconds. The deck of the USS Gerald R was now 200 miles behind them, but the connection remained through a secure satellite link that fed a constant stream of targeting data to the aircraft. The environment outside the cockpit was a stark contrast to the high-intensity battle happening on the screens. The air was thin and freezing, the temperature outside the canopy dropping to 50 degrees below zero. Occasional flashes of lightning from a distant weather system illuminated the clouds below, revealing the jagged coastline of the mainland for a split second before the darkness returned. Every pilot in the formation could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that they were the tip of a spear that was about to strike at the very heart of the South Sea Fleet's power. The electronic screen was now fully established, a digital wall of American ingenuity that was successfully blinding the most sophisticated sensors the enemy possessed. By 4:28 in the morning, the first wave of F-35 Bravo fighters reached their launch points for the initial suppression of enemy air defenses. They were now less than 40 miles from the HQ-9 batteries, close enough that the enemy's infrared sensors might begin to pick up the heat of their engines. The flight lead checked his master arm switch, the green light on his console, confirming that his precision-guided munitions were ready for release. The electronic screen had done its job, providing the cover necessary to get the stealth fighters into position. The next phase of the operation was about to begin, and the silence of the night was seconds away from being shattered by the roar of American ordnance. 4:31 in the morning, the jagged coastline of the Leizhou Peninsula, the lead formation of F-35 Bravo fighters, belonging to the Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 211, crossed the fence into Chinese sovereign airspace at an altitude of 30,000 feet. The transition from the open sea to the rugged terrain of the mainland was marked by a sharp increase in the density of enemy electronic emissions. Inside the cockpits, the pilots saw their tactical displays bloom with amber and red icons as the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries transitioned from search mode to target tracking. The air at this altitude was a thin, freezing void of 45 degrees below zero, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic hum of the life support systems and the distant, muffled roar of the Pratt & Whitney Phone 135 engines. The strike package was now traveling at Mach 0.95, just below the speed of sound to maintain the highest level of stealth efficiency. Below them, the landscape was a dark tapestry of coastal villages and dense vegetation, occasionally broken by the white glow of security lights around military installations. The smell inside the flight gear was a mix of dry oxygen and the faint ozone scent of high-powered electronics working at maximum capacity. This was the moment of highest vulnerability. Despite their stealth coatings, the sheer number of Chinese sensors meant that a single mistake in flight path or altitude could lead to an immediate engagement. At 4:34 in the morning, the first kinetic response from the mainland began. 3 HQ-9 batteries, located near the city of Zhanjiang, launched a total of 12 interceptor missiles in a staggered sequence. From the perspective of the American pilots, the horizon was suddenly torn open by brilliant pillars of white-orange flame as the missiles accelerated toward the sky. At 4 times the speed of sound, the EA-18 Golf Growlers, flying 10 miles behind the strike lead, immediately increased their jamming output, flooding the guidance frequencies of the incoming missiles with high-energy digital noise. Break left. Vampire, Vampire. The command from the airborne early warning aircraft, an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye circling 50 miles offshore, was calm and professional. The lead F-35 Bravo pilot watched as his threat warning system calculated the intercept point of the first 2 missiles. He did not panic. Instead, he executed a precise 5G descending turn to the south, utilizing the terrain of the coastal hills to mask his radar return. Behind him, the HQ-9 missiles, blinded by the Growler's electronic screen, lost their track. One of the missiles self-destructed in a massive white flash that illuminated the clouds for 20 miles, while the other fell harmlessly into the rice paddies 5,000 feet below. Tactical engagement status. Coastal penetration platform roll status F-35 Bravo strike. Lead 12 active. 0 lost EA-18 Gulf Electronic Attack 6 active, providing full-screen HQ-9. Enemy long range. SAM-3 batteries active. 12 missiles. Expended environment visibility low. Heavy maritime mist below 10,000 feet. The suppression of these coastal batteries was now the primary focus of the mission. For every missile the Chinese launched, the American strike package responded with calculated shifts in formation and electronic countermeasures. The pilots of the United States Marine Corps and Navy were not merely flying aircraft. They were managing a complex, multi-dimensional chess game against a digital opponent. The pressure inside the cockpits was immense, the pilots' chests compressed by the high-G maneuvers as they wove through the invisible web of the Chinese defense network. By 4:38 in the morning, the strike package had successfully bypassed the outer ring of the coastal defenses. The city of Zhanjiang and its massive naval base were now only 40 miles away, appearing on the long-range infrared sensors as a high-contrast heat signature against the cool waters of the harbor. The air was thick with the scent of spent propellant from the enemy missiles, a sharp chemical bite that lingered even within the filtered cockpit environment. The first hurdle had been cleared, but the core of the South Sea Fleet remained ahead, protected by a dense forest of short-range anti-aircraft guns and point defense missiles. The F-35 Bravo flight lead leveled his wings and checked his weapon status. His internal bays remained closed, but the targeting data was already being fed into the 2 1,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munitions nestled within the fuselage. The mission was entering its most violent phase. The objective was no longer just to survive the crossing, it was to deliver a blow that would leave the Chinese naval capability in the region shattered beyond immediate repair. 4:40 in the morning. The skies over the northern Leizhou Peninsula. 2 EA, 18 Gulf Growlers from Electronic Attack Squadron 138, call sign Yellow Jacket 1 and 2, dipped their wings into a sharp bank toward the primary HQ-9 radar site. The mission had reached its most critical technical phase, the suppression of enemy air defenses. Without the destruction of the Chinese phased array radars, the following waves of strike aircraft would be flying into a wall of guided fire. The air at 20,000 feet was a turbulent mix of humid tropical air and the freezing currents of the upper atmosphere, creating a light chop that vibrated through the airframes of the multi-mission jets. Inside the cockpits, the electronic warfare officers were locked in a high-speed digital duel with Chinese radar operators located 5 miles below the forest canopy. The Chinese HQ-9 system was operating in a blink mode, rapidly turning its high-power search radars on and off to prevent American missiles from homing in on their signal. On the tactical displays of the Growlers, the radar signatures appeared as pulsating red spikes, each one a lethal finger reaching out to find the American formation. The electronic warfare officer in Yellow Jacket 1 adjusted the sensitivity of his NALQ-218 receiver, weight NNG, for the exact moment the Chinese radar stayed active for more than 3 seconds. The cockpit was illuminated by the pale green glow of the multifunction displays, reflecting off the visors of the crew and highlighting the sweat beginning to bead on their brows despite the chilled air of the environmental control system. At 4:43 in the morning, the Chinese radar at Site Alpha 1 locked onto a dummy target generated by the American jamming pods. The signature stayed solid. Magnum, Magnum. The pilot of Yellow Jacket 1 called over the secure radio link. He squeezed the trigger on the control stick, and 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles detached from the underwing pylons. The missiles dropped for a fraction of a second before their solid-fuel rocket motors ignited with a brilliant white flash. They accelerated instantly to twice the speed of sound, leaving behind 2 distinct trails of gray smoke that hung in the humid air like jagged scars. The missiles were designed with a single purpose: to follow the radar beam directly to its source, even if the enemy turned the transmitter off. Below the flight path, the environment of the Chinese coastline was a chaotic scene of mobilized military activity. The smell of diesel exhaust from hundreds of transport trucks and the sharp, metallic scent of cold sea air filled the valleys near the base. The radar array, a massive hexagonal structure, mounted on a heavy 8-wheeled truck, sat in a cleared patch of jungle surrounded by camouflage netting. The Chinese crew, realizing the incoming threat, attempted to cut power to the transmitter, but the missiles had already memorized the last known coordinates of the signal. The missiles adjusted their control fins with millisecond precision, diving at a 60-degree angle toward the heart of the radar site. The impact was catastrophic. The 2 missiles struck within 3 meters of the primary radar face, their fragmentation warheads detonating with a force that shredded the electronics and ignited the vehicle's fuel supply. A massive fireball erupted in the middle of the jungle, clearing, throwing twisted pieces of steel and smoking circuitry 50 meters into the surrounding trees. At 4:45 in the morning, the primary search radar for the Zhanjiang northern sector went dark. On the screens of the USS Gerald R. 200 miles away, the red icon representing the radar site blinked once and then disappeared, replaced by a blue X indicating a confirmed kill. With the northern radar destroyed, the second Growler, Yellow Jacket 2, pivoted toward a second site located on a small island 3 miles off the coast. This site was protected by a short-range point defense system, which began firing hundreds of 30mm rounds into the sky in a desperate attempt to intercept the incoming American missiles. The night was illuminated by the red tracers of the anti-aircraft guns, creating a deadly lattice of light over the water. The pilot of Yellow Jacket 2 ignored the fire, releasing his final 2 AGM-88 missiles into the center of the tracer. Fire. The missiles punched through the curtain of lead, impacting the island's radar tower and collapsing it into the sea in a cloud of sparks and steam. By 4:48 in the morning, the electronic corridor was wide open. The suppression of enemy air defenses had been 85% successful, leaving the inner harbor of Zhanjiang vulnerable to the main strike force. The air over the peninsula was now thick with the smell of burning high-octane fuel and the acrid stench of scorched earth. The EA-18 Gulf Growlers, their primary mission complete, banked hard to the east to take up a support position over the water. They had blinded the giant, and now the heavy hitters were moving in to finish the job. The first wave of Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from the escorting destroyers 40 minutes ago, were now less than 5 miles from the harbor mouth. 4:55 in the morning. Zhanjiang Harbor. The first wave of 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from the cruiser CG-73 and the destroyer DDG-113, crested the coastal hills at an altitude of only 30 meters. The missiles had traveled over 200 miles in total electronic silence, guided by GPS and terrain contour matching. Now, as they reached the final waypoint of their flight paths, they performed a programmed pop-up maneuver, climbing steeply before diving directly into their assigned targets across the sprawling naval complex. The air over the harbor, once still and heavy with the scent of tropical humidity and salt, was suddenly torn apart by the low-frequency drone of dozens of small jet engines. Inside the cockpit of the lead F-35 Bravo, the pilot watched the target area through the high-resolution feed of his electro-optical targeting system. The entire South Sea Fleet headquarters was laid out in infrared, a series of glowing heat signatures against the cool gray of the concrete piers. He checked his master arm switch and verified the coordinates for his two 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions. The mission had moved from the suppression of air defenses to the systematic dismantling of the enemy's command and control infrastructure. The pilot could see the first Tomahawks already impacting the outer fuel farms, the flashes of light so bright they briefly washed out his night vision display. The trigger was squeezed. The internal weapons bay doors of the stealth fighter cycled open in less than 1 second, and the two massive bombs fell into the slipstream. The munitions utilized their GPS-guided fins to correct their flight paths, falling through the humid air with a low, whistling sound that was quickly drowned out by the chaos below. The pilot banked his aircraft to the north, pulling a 6G turn to stay clear of the incoming second wave of cruise missiles. Below him, the base was beginning to wake up, with searchlights sweeping the sky and the first few anti-aircraft guns opening fire in a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to defend the harbor. The 1,000-pound warhead of the lead Tomahawk cruise missile punched through the reinforced concrete roof of the 4-story South Sea Fleet Command Center. The detonation was instantaneous. The building did not merely collapse. It erupted from the inside out, sending 5-ton slabs of concrete, twisted rebar flying 200 meters into the harbor. A column of oily black smoke and pulverized masonry rose 600 feet into the air, illuminated by the white-hot core of the explosion that reached temperatures of over 3,000 degrees. The shockwave shattered every window. Within a 2-kilometer radius, the sound of breaking glass lost in the roar of the blast that compressed the air until it felt as solid as a wall. On the piers below, Chinese sailors scrambled toward their battle stations, but the pressure wave threw dozens of men off the decks of the moored Type 55 destroyers and into the oily water of the bay. The close-in weapon systems on the nearest ship began to rotate wildly, spitting thousands of rounds of 30mm tungsten into the smoke. But the radar was blinded by the expanding cloud of debris and electromagnetic interference. A secondary explosion from a nearby fuel bunker, hit by a second Tomahawk, sent a wall of orange fire rolling across the asphalt, incinerating 3 transport trucks and a crane instantly. The smell of burning diesel, scorched earth, and electrical insulation filled the air, a thick and acrid fog that blotted out the stars. The harbor was no longer a structured military facility. It was a landscape of fire and shredded steel. The silence of the pre-dawn morning was gone, replaced by the roar of burning fuel and the rhythmic, deep-seated thud of more incoming missiles, finding their marks across the pier infrastructure. Two of the largest dry docks, currently holding a destroyer and a replenishment ship, were hit by a tandem strike that collapsed the dock gates. Millions of gallons of seawater rushed into the dry docks in a violent torrent, slamming the multi-ton vessels against the concrete walls and snapping their mooring lines like threads. The physical destruction was absolute, the result of decades of American precision strike doctrine executed with surgical lethality. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the primary command center was a smoking crater, and the harbor's power grid had been completely severed. The F-35 Bravo pilot leveled his wings at 20,000 feet, looking back at the inferno he had helped create. The fires were visible from 50 miles away, a series of brilliant orange blossoms against the black velvet of the Chinese coastline. The first phase of the kinetic assault was a total success, leaving the South Sea Fleet leadership decapitated and its most vital infrastructure in ruins. But the battle for the harbor was only beginning, as the heavy surface combatants of the Chinese Navy began to fight back from their moorings. 5:00 to 5 in the morning. The inner harbor of Zhanjiang, located at coordinates 21 degrees, 12 minutes north, 110 degrees, 25 minutes east. The primary naval assets of the South Sea Fleet were no longer sitting idle at their moorings. 2 Type 55 destroyers and 3 Type 052 Delta destroyers were desperately trying to build enough steam to get underway, their massive gas turbine engines churning the oily water into a frothy white wake. The air was a suffocating mix of thick black smoke from the burning headquarters and the sharp ozone smell of active radar systems. High above, the second wave of strike aircraft from Carrier Air Wing 8, consisting of 12 FA-18 Echo Super Hornets, rolled into a steep dive, their targeting pods locked onto the largest radar signatures in the bay. The lead Super Hornet, call sign Rock 1, transitioned from a high-altitude cruise to a focused attack profile. The pilot's hands were steady on the flight controls, his breathing rhythmic through the oxygen mask. On his tactical display, the silhouette of a Type 55 destroyer, the most powerful surface combatant in the Chinese inventory, was centered in the crosshairs. The ship was already fighting back, its close-in weapon systems spitting thousands of 30mm rounds into the air, creating a wall of lead and fire that illuminated the harbor in jagged, staccato flashes. The sound of the anti-aircraft fire was a continuous, low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the cockpit glass. Even at 10,000 feet, the trigger was squeezed. An AGM-158 Charlie long-range anti-ship missile detached from the centerline pylon of the Super Hornet with a heavy metallic clunk. The missile fell for exactly 2 seconds before its turbojet engine kicked in with a muffled roar, sending a jet of blue-white flame backward into the humid morning air. The heat from the ignition washed over the underside of the fighter jet, a brief but intense thermal pulse that the pilot could feel through the floorboards. The missile immediately dropped to an altitude of only 5 meters above the water, its stealthy skin absorbing the enemy radar pulses as it raced toward the harbor at 800 kilometers per hour. The AGM-158 Charlie punched through the thin steel hull of the Type 55 destroyer just above the waterline, exactly midway between the forward vertical launch system and the bridge. The 800-pound blast fragmentation warhead detonated inside the auxiliary machinery room, the explosion instantly expanding at 5,000 meters per second. The force of the blast did not just rupture the hull, it tore the ship open like a tin can. A massive fireball, 300 feet wide, erupted from the port side, bleaching the pre-dawn sky a brilliant, blinding white for 3 full seconds. The shockwave slammed into the nearby pier with such force that a 20-ton crane was lifted off its tracks and thrown into the water. The Chinese destroyer reacted with a violent, agonizing shudder that sent hundreds of sailors flying across the decks. The bridge crew was incinerated instantly as the fireball traveled up the ventilation shafts, blowing the windows out of the command center in a cloud of glass shards and melted plastic. The ship began to list heavily to port as thousands of gallons of seawater rushed into the breached machinery spaces. On the aft deck, the remaining crew attempted to launch a surface-to-air missile, but the fire had already severed the electrical conduits. The vessel was a dying giant, its internal alarms screaming a futile warning as the secondary explosions from stored ammunition began to rip the superstructure apart from the inside. Black smoke boiled out of the jagged hole in the destroyer's side, rising in a dense, swirling column that blotted out the remaining stars. The burning wreckage of the ship was still settling into the silt of the harbor floor when the radio channels of the Chinese formation erupted in a cacophony of panicked voices and overlapping orders. The heat from the burning Type 55 was so intense that the paint on a neighboring frigate began to blister and peel away in large, blackened sheets. The harbor was now a graveyard of high-tech steel, the silence of the aftermath broken only by the crackle of burning electronics and the distant, fading roar of the American Super Hornets climbing back into the safety of the clouds. By 5:15 in the morning, the pride of the South Sea Fleet was a shattered, listing ruin. The strike had been surgically precise, claiming the most dangerous surface threat in the region with a single, well-placed munition. The Super Hornets of Carrier Air Wing 8 leveled their wings at 15,000 feet, having expended only a fraction of their total ordnance. Below them, the harbor was a chaotic landscape of sinking hulls and spreading oil slicks, the orange glow of the fires reflecting off the water for miles. The mission was progressing with a lethal efficiency that left no room for an effective Chinese countermove, but the air superiority battle over the Gulf of Tonkin was just beginning to intensify. 5:20 in the morning. The high-altitude darkness over the Gulf of Tonkin, 80 miles west of the carrier strike group, 4 F-22 Raptors from the 1st Fighter Wing patrolled at an altitude of 50,000 feet, their presence invisible to the conventional radar arrays along the Chinese coast. The air at this height was a thin, freezing vacuum of 60 degrees below zero, and the cockpit canopies were coated in a specialized metallic film that shimmered with a dull gold hue in the dim light of the instrument panels. The pilots were breathing pure oxygen, their chests rising and falling in the rhythmic, mechanical cadence of men sustained by high-pressure life support systems. The tactical situation was transitioning from a localized strike to a theater-wide air superiority duel. On the integrated mission displays, 4 high-priority targets appeared, moving south from the airbase at Nanning at a speed of Mach 1.4. These were J-20 stealth fighters, the most advanced interceptors in the Chinese inventory, sent to challenge the American dominance of the airspace. The F-22 Raptors did not turn toward the threat immediately. Instead, they utilized their stealth profiles to maintain a flanking position, waiting for the optimal engagement window. The environment inside the cockpit was a silent sanctuary of green data streams and synthetic audio cues, a stark contrast to the supersonic roar of the wind only inches away. The flight-led, callsign Raptor 1, coordinated the engagement over a low probability of intercept data link that left no electronic footprint for the enemy to track. The American pilots were not using their own radars, they were receiving targeting data from an E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control aircraft flying 200 miles to the south. This silent attack doctrine allowed the Raptors to remain ghosts in the machine until the very moment of weapon release. As the distance between the two formations closed to 40 miles, the internal weapons bays of the lead Raptor cycled open with a faint, mechanical hum that could be felt through the pilot's seat. The trigger was squeezed. An AIM-120 Delta missile shrieked off the internal launcher, a white column of fire punching backward into the thin air. The heat blast from the rocket motor washed across the underside of the Raptor, momentarily bleaching the dark belly of the aircraft with a brilliant orange glow. The smoke from the launch was a dense, white streak that hung in the upper atmosphere for 3 seconds before the missile accelerated past Mach 4, its independent radar seeker activating for the final terminal phase of the flight. The AIM-120 Delta warhead punched clean through the titanium fuselage of the lead J-20 stealth fighter, detonating directly behind the cockpit. The impact was absolute. The Chinese aircraft did not just break apart. It erupted in a single, catastrophic flash of white-hot magnesium and burning jet fuel. The nose of the aircraft was severed instantly, and the two massive engines were sent tumbling into the dark void below, trailing long ribbons of orange fire. The pilot of the second J-20 reacted by pulling a desperate 9G brake turn to the left, his wings shedding vapor as he dumped a cloud of flares into the sky. But the American technology was too fast. A second AIM-120 Delta found its mark, shredding the right wing of the trailing fighter and sending the aircraft into a flat, unrecoverable spin toward the sea. The remaining two Chinese interceptors immediately broke formation and fled to the north, their afterburners appearing as two tiny, fading stars on the edge of the horizon. Black smoke and glowing debris from the first kill were still settling through the lower cloud decks 10,000 feet below when the radio channels of the F-22 formation returned to a state of disciplined silence. By 5:30 in the morning, the air over the Gulf of Tonkin was firmly under United States control. The engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds, but it had effectively neutralized the only immediate threat to the returning strike packages. The F-22 Raptors closed their weapons bays and returned to their high-altitude orbits, their sensors scanning the empty sky for any further movement. Below them, the fires at Zhanjiang were still raging, a grim testament to the combined lethality of the American carrier air wing and its high-altitude guardians. 5:40 in the morning, 200 miles southeast of the Chinese coastline. The air was a freezing, high-altitude desert, 50 degrees below zero, where the only sign of human presence was the long, white contrails of the aerial refueling tracks. Above the dark expanse of the South China Sea, the survival of the strike package depended on a delicate, high-speed ballet of physics and plumbing. 3 MQ-25 Stingray unmanned tankers, launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford an hour earlier, maintained a steady orbit at 24,000 feet. Their internal tanks held 15,000 pounds of JP-5 jet fuel each, a life-giving liquid that was now being distributed to the thirsty engines of the returning FA-18 Echo Super Hornets. The lead Super Hornet, having just expended its ordnance over Zhanjiang, approached the refueling drogue with surgical precision. The pilot's eyes were locked on the basket, a funnel-shaped mesh trailing behind the drone on a 20-meter hose. The wind at this altitude screamed past the cockpit at 500 kilometers per hour, creating a rhythmic vibration that rattled the pilot's teeth. The smell inside the flight suit was a stale mix of sweat and recycled oxygen, but the pilot's focus remained absolute. With a gentle push of the throttle, the refueling probe on the nose of the Dan fighter made contact with the basket. A heavy metallic thud vibrated through the airframe, followed by the hiss of high-pressure fuel rushing into the wing tanks at a rate of 400 gallons per minute. For exactly 3 minutes, the two aircraft flew as one, a single unit of steel and titanium connected by a thin rubber umbilical cord. The pilot watched the digital fuel gauge climb from 3,000 pounds to 10,000. Providing the necessary margin to return to the carrier and enter the landing pattern. Once the transfer was complete, the Super Hornet disconnected, a small cloud of amber fuel vapor spraying into the air before being instantly dissipated by the slipstream. This was the unseen spine of American air power, the logistics that allowed a carrier air wing to project force hundreds of miles from the ship and remain on station for hours. Without this constant cycle of replenishment, the strike would have been a one-way mission. 60 miles to the south, the USS Gerald R. Ford was executing its own logistical miracle. The flight deck was a chaotic, high-intensity industrial zone illuminated by the floodlights of the island superstructure. As the first wave of F-35 Bravo fighters trapped on the arrestor wires and taxied to their parking spots, the deck crews moved in like a swarm of angry hornets. Red-shirted ordnance technicians utilized specialized hydraulic lifts to move 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs from the elevators to the aircraft. The air on the deck was a suffocating fog of burnt rubber, hot hydraulic fluid, and the acrid stench of jet exhaust. The wind over the deck was a steady 35 knots, pulling at the sleeves of the sailors' jerseys as they worked to rearm. The jets in record time. The goal was a turnaround time of less than 45 minutes. Each aircraft had to be inspected for battle, damage, refueled, and loaded with a fresh set of precision munitions before being sent back to the catapults. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar, the rhythmic thud of the arrestor wires, the hiss of the catapults, and the scream of engines being tested at full power. In the back, hangar deck below, mechanics worked in a pool of white light to repair a jagged hole in the vertical stabilizer of one Super Hornet, caused by a piece of anti-aircraft shrapnel. The smell of grinding metal and welding sparks filled the cavernous space, a reminder that the cost of the strike was measured in more than just fuel and bombs. By 6:15 in the morning, the second wave was 80% ready for launch. The logistics of the carrier strike group were functioning at a peak efficiency rarely seen outside of a full-scale theater war. Over 12,000 pounds of high explosives had already been moved from the deep magazines to the flight deck, and over 100,000 pounds of fuel had been pumped into the orbiting aircraft. The carrier was not just a runway, it was a mobile, self-sustaining factory of destruction. The deck was now crowded with the second strike package, 24 aircraft fueled, armed, and ready to deliver the final blow to the Zhanjiang submarine pens. The air boss in the tower checked the status of the recovery and launch cycles on his digital board. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon, casting a long, golden light across the whitecaps of the sea. The logistics phase was reaching its transition point. The first wave of pilots, exhausted and shaking from the adrenaline of combat, were climbing out of their cockpits and heading for the debriefing rooms, while the fresh pilots of the second wave were strapping in. The machine was reset. The logistical loop was closed. The United States Navy was ready to finish what it had started 4 hours earlier, 6:30 in the morning. The skies over Zhanjiang were no longer black, but a bruised, smoky purple, as the first light of dawn struggled to penetrate the pillars of soot rising from the harbor. The second wave of the strike, consisting of 24 FA-18 Echo Super Hornets and F-35 Bravo fighters, approached from the southeast at an altitude of 15,000 feet. The mission had reached its terminal phase, the total destruction of the South Sea Fleet's strategic reserves and its reinforced submarine pens. The air was heavy with the smell of the morning tide, now irrevocably tainted by the acrid chemical stench of thousands of tons of burning marine diesel and the metallic bite of vaporized aluminum. The lead Super Hornet of Strike Fighter Squadron 37, call sign Rage 1, centered the crosshairs of its targeting pod on the massive concrete arches of the underground submarine pens. At coordinates 21 degrees, 12 minutes north, 110 degrees, 25 minutes east. These structures were built with 20 feet of reinforced concrete and covered in layers of earth, designed to withstand anything short of a direct nuclear strike. The pilot adjusted his master arm to air-to-ground and selected the GBU-31 Bunker Buster, a 2,000-pound munition, equipped with a hardened steel penetrator and a delayed action fuse. The trigger was squeezed. The 2,000-pound bomb detached from the wing pylon, its guidance fins immediately snapping into position to catch the air. The munition fell in a steep, ballistic arc, accelerating until it reached the speed of sound. There was no whistle, only a low-frequency hum as it sliced through the humid air. The bomb struck the center of the third submarine pen, the hardened nose cone punching through 20 feet of concrete, as if it were wet sand. For a fraction of a second, there was a dead silence as the weapon buried itself deep into the granite foundation before the delayed fuse reached zero. The detonation occurred 30 feet underground. The earth itself seemed to ripple like water as the shockwave traveled through the bedrock. A massive plume of pulverized concrete, mud, and white-hot fire erupted from the entrance of the pen, followed by the sound of a subterranean roar that could be felt in the chests of the pilots 2 miles above. The reinforced ceiling of the pen, weighing thousands of tons, collapsed inward, crushing the Type 094 nuclear submarine moored inside. Secondary explosions from the vessel's own torpedoes ripped through the remaining structure. sending a wall of pressurized water and fire surging out into the harbor like a volcanic eruption. Simultaneously, 12 miles to the east, the second half of the strike package targeted the primary fuel storage farm. Each Super Hornet released 4 1,000-pound joint direct attack munitions, creating a coordinated grid of fire across the 32 massive storage tanks. The impact was instantaneous and total. Millions of gallons of refined aviation fuel and diesel ignited in a single, colossal fireball that reached temperatures of 5,000 degrees. The heat was so intense that the nearby security fences melted into liquid puddles of wire, and the oxygen was sucked out of the surrounding atmosphere, with a sound like a giant gasping for breath. A black mushroom cloud, thick and oily, rose 3,000 feet into the air, blotted out the sun, and cast the entire peninsula into a premature, artificial night. The environment of the base was now a landscape of total obliteration. The sound of the explosions was a continuous, rolling thunder that shattered the eardrums of anyone within 3 miles. The smell of burning rubber, high-octane fuel, and scorched earth formed a toxic fog that drifted over the city of Zhanjiang, turning the morning light into a sickly orange glow. On the piers, the remaining support buildings were leveled by the overpressure, their steel frames twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The South Sea Fleet's ability to sustain operations was not just hindered, it was physically erased from the map. By 6:45 in the morning, the second wave had expended its final munitions. The pilots of Carrier Air Wing 8 leveled their wings and banked toward the open sea, leaving behind a horizon dominated by fire. The underground pens were now a graveyard of concrete and twisted hulls, and the fuel farm was a lake of molten steel and burning oil. The strategic heart of the Chinese naval presence in the region had been cut out with surgical, American precision. The obliteration requested by the execution order was complete. As the strike aircraft accelerated toward the USS Gerald R. the only thing remaining in the skies over Zhanjiang was the drifting ash of a shattered fleet. 6:50 in the morning, 200 miles east of the Chinese coastline. The USS Gerald R. and its escorts were no longer hunters. They were now targets. As the final strike aircraft of the second wave crossed the maritime border and headed for the safety of the carrier's radar umbrella, the Chinese military launched its long-awaited response from the deep interior of the mainland. From mobile TEL launchers hidden in the hills of Guangdong Province, 6 DF-21 Delta anti-ship ballistic missiles tore into the sky. The missiles accelerated to 5 times the speed of sound in seconds, their solid rocket motors leaving massive white plumes that were visible for 50 miles against the blue of the morning. The carrier killers reached the edge of space before their kinetic kill vehicles detached, beginning a hypersonic plunge toward the coordinates of the American strike group. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the cruiser CG-73, the air was cold and filled with the low hum of high-powered servers and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. The tactical action officer stared at the overhead glass display, where 6 red icons were descending at a speed of over 6,000 kilometers per hour. The ship was already at general quarters, the crew wearing flash protective gear and gas masks, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue light of the AN/SPY-6 radar consoles. Vampire, vampire, vampire. Multiple inbound ballistic tracks, bearing 305. Elevation 80 degrees. The voice of the radar operator was sharp but controlled, the product of 1,000 hours of simulated drills. The trigger was squeezed on the Mark 41 vertical launch system. From the forward decks of the cruiser and the destroyer DDG-113, 12 Standard Missile, 6 interceptors erupted into the morning light. The missiles cleared the deck in a sequence of deafening roars, the orange flame of their boosters reflecting off the white caps of the sea. The air around the ships was suddenly thick with the smell of burnt propellant and the sharp, metallic tang of ionized air. The interceptors climbed vertically, their own active radar seekers searching for the incoming Chinese warheads in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. The first DF-21 Delta warhead was intercepted 50 miles above the carrier. The Standard Missile-6 punched straight into the center of the Chinese kill vehicle. The combined kinetic energy of the collision creating a brilliant white flash that was visible from the flight deck even in the growing sunlight. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but the physical result was absolute. The Chinese warhead was reduced to a cloud of harmless titanium fragments and molten electronics, which burned up like falling stars as they re-entered the atmosphere. 2 more interceptions followed in rapid succession, the sky above the strike group filled with the jagged white scars of successful kills. However, the saturation of the defense was the enemy's primary tactic. The 4th DF-21 Delta warhead executed a high-G terminal maneuver, dodging the first interceptor and plunging toward the destroyer DDG-113. The destroyer's close-in weapon system, a 20mm phalanx Gatling gun, opened fire at a range of 2 miles. The sound was a continuous, mechanical scream. As it spat 4,000 rounds per minute into the sky, the red tracers creating a solid line of fire. The Chinese warhead was struck by hundreds of tungsten rounds and detonated only 500 meters above the water. The shockwave from the explosion slammed into the side of the destroyer with the force of a physical hammer. The ship listed 10 degrees to starboard, and every sailor on the bridge was thrown to the deck by the violent vibration. The heat blast from the detonation scorched the paint on the forward superstructure and shattered the lenses of 2 external cameras. While the hull remained intact, the shock of the near miss caused a temporary power surge that knocked out the primary fire control computer for exactly 12 seconds. The air around the ship was a chaotic mix of steam, smoke, and the smell of ozone. But the vessel remained in the fight, its damage control teams already moving to the affected compartments. By 7:15 in the morning, the immediate missile threat had been neutralized. The carrier strike group had successfully defended itself against the most dangerous weapons in the Chinese inventory, but the cost was reflected in the empty cells of the vertical launch systems. The USS Gerald R turned into the wind. To begin the recovery of the strike aircraft, the deck crews working with a frantic urgency to get the jets out of the air before the next wave of missiles could be launched. The egress was nearly complete, and the strike group began its high-speed withdrawal to the south, moving away from the mainland at 35 knots. The battle had shifted from a localized strike to a desperate race for open water, with the shadow of the Chinese mainland still looming large on the radar screens. 8 in the morning, high over the South China Sea, an 8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System aircraft, flying in a racetrack pattern 80 miles off the coast, began the grim process of battle damage assessment. The air inside the pressurized cabin was cold and smelled of stale coffee and electronic heat, a contrast to the searing destruction being mapped on the high-resolution monitors. Using synthetic aperture radar that could peer through the thickest columns of black smoke, the American analysts began to quantify the obliteration of the Zhanjiang naval complex. The data was fed in real time back to the USS Gerald R. Ford and Pacific Command headquarters, painting a picture of a strategic asset that had been effectively removed from the Chinese order of battle. The physical destruction of the harbor was absolute. The primary pier infrastructure, spanning over 3 kilometers of waterfront, was confirmed as 75% destroyed. The South Sea Fleet Headquarters building was a hollowed-out skeleton of blackened concrete, with the surrounding administrative annexes reduced to piles of smoking rubble. At coordinates 21 degrees, 12 minutes north, 110 degrees, 25 minutes east, the underground submarine pens showed signs of massive structural failure. Satellite imagery confirmed the collapse of 3 primary pens, with thermal signatures indicating secondary internal fires that would likely render the entire underground complex unusable for years. The toll on the Chinese surface fleet was catastrophic. Analysts confirmed the total loss of 2 Type 55 guided missile destroyers, both of which had settled onto the harbor floor in 30 meters of water. 3 Type 052 Delta destroyers were listed as severely damaged, their superstructures shredded by fragmentation, and their internal systems gutted by fire. In the dry docks, 2 support vessels and 1 frigate were overturned and partially submerged. their hulls twisted by the force of the water that had rushed in when the gates failed. The total tonnage of Chinese naval vessels destroyed or disabled in the 4-hour strike was estimated at over 80,000 tons. The logistics of the base were equally shattered. The primary fuel storage farm, which once held over 50 million gallons of marine and aviation fuel, was a landscape of twisted metal and cooling slag. The fires were still burning with enough intensity to be detected by infrared sensors hundreds of miles away. The main ammunition depot and the missile storage facilities had been leveled, with craters measuring 30 meters in diameter, marking the spots where secondary detonations had occurred. The environment was a toxic wasteland of chemical runoff and oil slicks that covered the entirety of the inner harbor, a shimmering black coating that blotted out the natural color of the water. The cost to the United States forces, while significant, was light in comparison to the damage inflicted. Carrier Air Wing 8 reported the loss of 2 FA-18 Echo Super Hornets, both pilots having successfully ejected and currently awaiting rescue by MH-60 Sierra search and rescue helicopters. One F-35V Bravo had sustained minor damage from anti-aircraft fire but had returned safely to the carrier deck. The destroyer, DDG-113, reported 11 personnel injured and minor superficial damage to its superstructure from the near miss of the DF-21 Delta ballistic missile. Every other vessel in the strike group remained fully mission capable, their defensive magazines being replenished as they moved further into the open ocean. Casualty estimates for the Chinese personnel at the base were high, though impossible to confirm exactly. Initial assessments suggested over 2,000 military and civilian personnel had been killed or seriously injured in the initial waves of the strike. The decapitation of the South Sea Fleet leadership was assumed to be total, as no organized radio traffic had been detected from the headquarters frequency since the first Tomahawk impacted at 4:55 in the morning. The base was no longer a functioning military installation. It was a scene of chaos and mourning, with the remaining local forces focused entirely on fire suppression and recovery rather than counterattack. By 8:30 in the morning, the assessment was complete. The mission objectives of Operation Iron Threshold had been achieved with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. The United States had demonstrated that no fortress was impregnable and that the power of a carrier strike group remained the ultimate arbiter of maritime control. The report was encrypted and sent to the President of the United States, marking the end of the combat phase and the beginning of a new, uncertain geopolitical reality. The carrier strike group continued its high-speed withdrawal. The wake of the ships, a white line of defiance across the dark blue of the Pacific. 9 in the morning on the 12th of January, 2026, 250 miles southeast of the Chinese coastline. The USS Gerald R. Ford maintained a steady course at 32 knots, its bow slicing through the deep blue swells of the open Pacific. The high-intensity deck operations had finally slowed to a rhythmic, sustainable pace. The air on the flight deck, once a screaming vortex of jet exhaust and combat urgency, was now filled with the clean, salt-heavy breeze of the open sea. Tired sailors in grease-stained jerseys sat against the bulkheads, their eyes red from 72 hours of constant vigilance, watching as the final MH-60 Sierra search and rescue helicopter touched down on the aft deck, carrying the 2 downed pilots recovered from the Gulf of Tonkin. Inside the flag bridge, the Admiral of Carrier Strike Group 11 stood before a wall of SOCs, digital displays that told the story of a transformed theater. The red icons that once dominated the northern sector of the PON, South China Sea, the sensors, the missile batteries, and the surface combatants were gone, replaced by static markers indicating wreckage and neutralized zones. The destruction of the Zhanjiang naval base was not merely a tactical victory. It was a fundamental shift in the regional balance of power. The South Sea Fleet, which had spent a decade projecting strength across the maritime heart of Asia, was now a force without a heart, its command structure shattered, and its primary logistics hub reduced to a smoldering graveyard of concrete and steel. The strategic results of Operation Iron Threshold were being analyzed in real time by every major capital in the world. By neutralizing the underground submarine pens and the primary fuel reserves, the United States had effectively grounded the Chinese submarine fleet in the region for the foreseeable future. Without the specialized maintenance facilities and the high-grade diesel stored at Zhanjiang, the remaining Chinese vessels were tethered to smaller, less capable ports, their operational range cut by 60%. The anti-access, area denial bubble that had once threatened to push American influence out of the first island chain had been popped with surgical, devastating precision. The geopolitical fallout was immediate. In the halls of the United Nations, the rhetoric was shifting from confrontation to a desperate search for de-escalation. The display of American technical superiority, the ability to blind the most advanced radar networks, and intercept hypersonic ballistic missiles had restored a level of deterrence that many had thought lost to the history books. Allies across the Pacific, from Tokyo to Manila, were already coordinating with the United States 7th Fleet to establish a new, more robust defensive perimeter, bolstered by the knowledge that the American carrier remains the most lethal platform on the planet. Despite the decisive victory, the atmosphere on board the USS Gerald R. was one of professional reflection rather than celebration. The cost of the operation was written in the empty bunks of the fallen and the jagged shrapnel scars on the hull of the destroyer DDG-113. Every officer and sailor understood that this was not the end of the tension, but the beginning of a new, more complex chapter of high-stakes competition. The carrier strike group was already receiving new orders to reposition toward the Philippine Sea, ready to respond to any secondary move by the adversary. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the smoke from the mainland was no longer visible, lost behind the curvature of the Earth. The carrier's wake formed a long, straight line of white foam that stretched back toward the horizon, a temporary scar on the face of the water. Below decks, the pilots of Carrier Air Wing 8 were already being briefed on the next series of patrols, their faces grim and focused. The machine of American power was not stopping. It was merely resetting, its teeth sharpened by the reality of combat. The final report from Pacific Command was logged into the permanent record at 10 in the morning. Mission success. All primary objectives achieved. The Zhanjiang naval base was confirmed as a total strategic loss for the bout. Enemy. The USS Gerald R. and its escorts continued their push into the deep water, disappearing into the vastness of the Pacific as the guardians of a hard-won, fragile peace. The silence of the open ocean returned, broken only by the steady, powerful thrum of the carrier's nuclear reactors, pushing 80,000 tons of American resolve toward the next horizon.